is the fantasy football community being too harsh on Tyreek Hill or not harsh enough? That and more this week on the couch. JJ Zachariason. Tyreek Hill was a top 5 pick last year. He's a third round pick this year. That's either going to look really smart or really stupid. What do you think? Who's going to be right when 2025 is over? Which camp is going to be right about Tyreek Hill?
So I'll say this. I'll lead to the answer. I think that I have a hard time believing that the 2024 Miami Dolphins offense is what we should expect in 2025, just because of the tumultuous situation that they endured, with Tua. The offensive line was, not playing and performing very well. And that led to these really just, low A dot looks, very easy outlet passes to Devon Achane and Jonnu Smith. That's why Jonnu Smith emerged the second half of the year. And you look at what Tua did when he came back, and they didn't deploy and use their wide receivers the way they had during the other years that they've had Mike McDaniel. And so, you kind of look under the hood at what Tyreek did analytically last year. 21.5% target share per game rate. That's one of the lowest marks since his rookie year. His yards per route run was still 1.75, which is not Tyreek Hill-esque, but it's not, I'm a terrible wide receiver all of a sudden esque, right? And he saw a target on 22% of his routes. I think that Miami is a candidate to turn things around this year with what you always talk about, rational coaching.
Yeah.
This is a scenario and situation where it's very hard to envision an offense running through Jonnu Smith the way that it did last year during the second half of the year, and Devon Achane as a receiver even. I think that we could see a bump down a tad, in target share for a guy like Achane. And I think, like, if you just look at what's going on in the rumor mill and in the media with the Jonnu contract and stuff like that, if he was that vital to that offense, things would be more in motion than they seem to be at the moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, very rarely are there such strong trade rumors for a player, obviously with the Arthur Smith connection,
Right.
but very, very rarely are there such strong trade rumors for a guy that is going to be such a central figure in an offense, right? Like look at Washington right now. You're going to get the social media accounts that are like, yeah, how about this Terry McLaurin trade I saw one today, Terry McLaurin to Pittsburgh for XYZ. It's like, okay, this is a clickbait thing. You're just throwing this out there just to throw it out there. But the Jonnu Smith thing has had legs. Like, teams are reaching out and all that. And the fact that it has legs to me tells me that, Jonnu Smith is has been an undervalued player throughout his career. I think we've kind of established that at this point. So this is no shade to Jonnu whatsoever. I just don't think that an offense that has Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle is all of a sudden going to continue to run their offense in that direction and through that way. I think that they had to adjust and adapt based on what was going on with the offensive line and with the Tua stuff. And now we have sort of this clean slate that they can run their offense the way they had before.
Yeah, and that answer really warms my heart, JJ. You and I have been doing shows for a long time, and I feel like it's again like you're aging like fine wine. We talked about this before the show, but what you're getting at, for all and to you and Mike Clay and everybody else out there that have really perfected using numbers to look at fantasy football to take stances and positions. I mean, it was like just an explosion, incredible, mind-boggling for someone like me who's the mayor of Narrative Street. But your answer basically is like, well, it depends on Mike McDaniel, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we're back to Narrative Street where you have to take a stand, okay? Like, what you can't do is throw up your hands and say, well, we can't know. You have to say, because what really happened, JJ, in the years we've been doing this, has there been a more stunning drop for an offense?
No, not that I can remember. At
Right.
least. I mean, it like especially with the tie to there being a top 5 pick, the way there was last year with Tyreek.
Sure.
Like, that was just a bizarre. I can't remember a situation quite like that.
And Waddle was like a second, third round pick. Achane was a second round pick. So yeah, we can go over this, right? Like 2 years ago, the Dolphins offense was like the Harlem Globetrotters. Like, they were just opening up vast space on the field, and Hill and Waddle and Achane were just slicing and dicing through defenses with these giant plays. Like they had numbers, those scatter plots, and there's like the Miami offense was way off on,
Yeah.
whatever it was, like depth of target or run after catch yards or whatever. The point was it didn't look right. It didn't look sustainable, and it wasn't sustainable, but it wasn't like they went back to the pack. They went to the
Right.
back of the pack.
Right.
And you're at this fork in the road where you're right. Okay, this is either like Mike McDaniel's last year as the coach for the Dolphins, because he's not going to be able to get them out of this tailspin. He's just not a strong enough force. He's a wizard, but he's not. I don't know if he can lead a team through like a rebuild.
Right.
But his superpower is his wizardry, and he has these pieces to work with. Now they are rebuilding the offensive line. Some names people need, like Patrick Paul is a really important name for this offense this year. So there's some of this stuff is unknowable, but if they can even get back to the middle of the pack, then Jalen Waddle in the 7th round instead of the 2nd or 3rd, that's an overreaction, right? Tyreek Hill falling all the way, that's an overreaction. Devin Achane's still a 2nd round pick, which shows the Devin Achane stands are not backing off. But he got his value last year the same way Jonnu did, kind of counterfeit.
Exactly.
But what's funny, I was talking to somebody about this, and they said, and I said, well, we're really betting on Miami's offense to get back from the bottom, because like my narrative street take, JJ, is this is kind of the point in the movie where the axe murderer jumps out of the closet and Miami Dolphins is the next victim. You know what I mean? Because you can feel like the dread.
Yeah. It feels like this is likely his last year as head coach there. Like it's definitely, because even if they do, like, I do think that just general regression and like any, again, rational human that would be leading an offense like that would be forced to change things up versus how they performed during the second half of last year in particular. But even still, what's it going to take for him to keep his job at this point? And to me, it's exceeding that some expectation.
Same as the playoffs in the AFC.
Right. Like,
that's
and
not an easy. That's not an easy path at all.
It's hard to envision that, right? It's hard to envision that. But with that being said, from a fantasy perspective, I do think we're going to see, obviously, to me, it's going to be easier to click Waddle's name than Tyreek's name, just because of cost.
Sure.
Right? So, and if you look at Jalen Waddle's history and you spot the outlier is very clearly last year. Whereas Tyreek Hill, you can at least start to create a story and a narrative that this is the downturn, right? Like this is
what a decline looks like.
Yeah, this, and again, like it's not always, like his peripheral numbers are a gradual decline as what we would see with a player his age and approaching that age. His raw totals and his raw numbers were not very good at all last year. He wasn't usable at times last year, like when Tua was sidelined, but his peripherals are showing the kind of decline that we do see from wide receivers that are aging, right? So like that could easily be the argument there. For Jalen Waddle, I'm just looking at like what he did during the first handful of years of his career, and those peripherals. And last year was just 15% target share. And even like when Tua was active last year, Jalen Waddle had like 13 or so PPR points per game. Like he wasn't, the Jalen Waddle of, year 2 or whatever, but he was still usable enough. So, it's going to be a lot easier for me to click his name than Tyreek's name for sure. I have, like in situations like this, I do, wonder, and we'll talk about another player, I'm sure today, who is in a similar boat. But I do wonder, like when there's not a seismic shift in coaching staff, if things, in the back of my head, I'm like, well, what if things do stay the same?
Exactly.
What if like if there's not a big event that occurs, like we're all optimistic about Jacksonville because the entire coaching staff is shifted and changed, right? And we knew that there's at least some really interesting talent profiles there. But the other guy that I'll just throw is Marvin Harrison Jr., where it's like the same coaching staff is there. So in the back of my head, I'm like, it's rational to think that he's going to see more crossers and be able to be deployed differently than he was last year. But what if he's not, because the coaching staff hasn't changed?
And it's the same proposition too, because Harrison wasn't as expensive last year as Hill. Harrison was a 2nd round pick. And that was kind of, that was one of the easier ones to see coming and be like, hey, no, don't do that, folks. Not in the 2nd round. But he just falling to the 3rd round, it's not like people are like, oh, we were just a little too bullish on Harrison last year, because really, there was, his production was concentrated it was like week 2, and everyone's like, well, geez, do I even start him after how poor week 1 went? And then you might have left him on the bench for that, for some reason.
Yeah.
And then he ended up living down to the expectations of not really being a reliable fantasy wide receiver that you took in the second round of your draft. And you would think, like, Jalen Waddle was in the second round in some drafts, and when he failed us last year, he's in the 6th round.
Right.
But at least the same coaches, and there's some really good analysis. Ben Solak, who I'm going to try to get on the couch this summer. Ben Solak, just real nice, just kind of watches the tape, very technically sound, but lets it wash over him to say, like, ooh, this is what I'm noticing. And with Harrison, I'll go ahead and emphasize this again. What he observed, which I think anybody watching the games could observe, is they weren't deploying Harrison to his strengths, first of all.
Mm-hmm.
So they had a different idea of what he was good at than like the rest of us when we watched him at Ohio State. And it was something that Kyler Murray wasn't good at, or at least Kyler Murray and Marvin Harrison Jr. were not good at the kind of connection needed to make the routes and the targets he was getting work. And you're right. Well, there's some talk, Terry McBride saying, well, they're moving us around. So, okay, great, free releases or something like that. But still, it's what insanity is expecting a different thing from the same circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
So Marvin Harrison is another tough one. I'm going to put a bunch of players together and again say this comes down to what do we expect to change, or we change back in the case of Patrick Mahomes. And JJ, we can include Rashee Rice, who he's like a 3rd, 4th round pick. Now Rashee Rice was number 2 overall, I think, whenever he got hurt.
Yeah,
So
before going down.
yeah, and I'm not saying he's gonna be number 2 overall. Xavier Worthy's come along, Marquise Brown is there, Jalen Royal sounds like he can do some stuff. But Rashee Rice could become more efficient with the evolution of Xavier Worthy as a deep threat, and we'll look back at him as a 3rd or 4th round pick and be like, that was low hanging fruit. It sounds like he's full participant in OTAs, so no worries about that mysterious knee injury being something that affects him into the season or camp, as long as knock on wood, no setbacks. Travis Kelce, wow, he's as cheap as he's ever been since he was like, I guess, coming off a microfracture surgery, and he was like 2nd year. So you can take a stand on Kansas City because the last few years, like, oh, it's going to come back. Patrick Mahomes is going to strike back. No lightning hasn't happened. So how do we split this difference, JJ?
Yeah, I think Kansas City is really interesting. So let's start with Mahomes because with quarterback, I think it's just gotten to the point where it's pretty binary in the way that we look at this, where are you a mobile quarterback? Are you able to run with the football? And if you are, great, we'll probably be targeting you. And if you're not, then we got to kind of look a little bit further and see why you have the ADP that you have and the cost that you have, et cetera. I've done obviously a lot of work on this kind of stuff, throughout my career. And then, in the draft guide that I do every year, I dig into, late round quarterbacking and mobile quarterbacks and all that kind of stuff. And it's funny because I think a lot of people just assume that I'm not an early round quarterback guy, but that's quite the opposite. I mean, even in our Apex league that you and I do every year, I think I've drafted an early round quarterback for like 3 straight years, in that format. And so I look at Mahomes and, the last 2 years hasn't gotten it done. He's basically been the equivalent of what you get from streaming the position, from a points per game perspective. He's been under the 3 rushing points per game mark during this time frame, which is a pretty consistent thing for him. If you look at what he did earlier on in his career when he was a unicorn in fantasy football, much of it just stemmed from a relatively unsustainable touchdown rate. Like that's what this comes down to. And of course, better players, better quarterbacks will have better touchdown rates. I'm not trying to, say otherwise. But touchdown rate is a metric that does tend to regress to a mean, and it's regressed to some mean for him over the last couple of years. And that's happened as the offense has kind of evolved from this, get it down the field a lot to a lower A dot kind of machine that they run there. And I think that's a big difference, is that personnel wise, I'm not sure there's enough there for me to say definitively that Mahomes is going to take a massive jump this year, right? Where I love, like, Rashee Rice, I'm in on Rashee Rice, just based on what we saw last year and the role that he plays in that offense. And I'll be the first to admit that I don't think Rashee Rice is Rashee Rice in pretty much any other system on the planet, right? Like this is the perfect fit for Rashee Rice and his skill set to play out of the slot, to be that yak guy for them. And that has a really big trickle effect and domino effect on the rest of the team. Xavier Worthy last year, if you look at what he did post, I think it was post by like week 10 onward and even into the playoffs, his production, because everyone's like, oh, I'm really hyped about Xavier Worthy because his points per game was really high and he was getting a lot of work. Well, obviously Rashee Rice wasn't playing, but also they started to deploy Xavier Worthy differently. They gave him some of those easier looks, lower A dot looks, even some more slot work than he was seeing before. He wasn't getting down the field as much during that second stretch versus how they started to deploy him to start. Now, obviously, they were deploying him to start that way because they probably thought that that's the best role that he would play. But also, Rashee Rice was playing the first 3.5 games of the season, and so they're not going to put Xavier Worthy in that kind of like lower A dot slot type role. But my problem though is that, and then this trickles over to Kelsey. Travis Kelsey was horrible with Rashee Rice last year, like really, really not good. And even without Rashee Rice last year, he was someone who didn't give us that great of production. His target share wasn't, or what was fine, but his production itself wasn't that great. His yards per route run, by far the worst of his career, the worst yards after catch per catch of his career last year. I think definitively Travis Kelsey is on the, Tyreek Hill, we're like maybe.
Right.
Travis Kelsey, we're like definitely.
Right.
This is the downturn of Travis Kelsey's career. And so, you look at how all of this plays together. I have a hard time being in on Travis Kelsey because of what we just talked about. With Rashee Rice last year, he was really, really not good. And, they're going to occupy similar levels and areas of the field as well, just given how they're deployed. And then with Xavier Worthy, I know that he's not someone that's necessarily as controversial, but I think Worthy, by the time August hits, he's going to be a really, really polarizing player in fantasy football because people are going to look at what he did down the stretch and get really excited. And he's a second-year guy, and that's always something that we're looking for because we want these breakouts and stuff. But I look at it as we know that Kansas City, for multiple years now, has not been throwing it down the field nearly as much as they did when Patrick Mahomes first broke out. And with Rashee Rice back in action, that's the role that Xavier Worthy is going to be asked to play more than he did down the stretch last year. And that scares me. Yeah. Whereas Rashee Rice, I think, has this stapled role. We know what he's likely going to command a high target share. So I'll buy into that, all day long.
Yeah, there's that theme emerging again of where we go out on a limb and end up getting hurt is saying, oh, this trajectory is going to change or course correct, but there's no new real element. And I guess this all started when the NFL tried to put Patrick Mahomes in a cage, basically, right? And say like, okay, you're only going to be able to operate within this. And he adapted. I mean, they're still a dynasty. They're still going to the Super Bowl.
Yes.
But there's another layer to it that's like, he's just not a good deep passer right now. I like how you talk about these metrics because I picture like the space shuttle, and you're getting back your mission control, and we have a certain course set for Travis Kelsey, and then the data coming back to mission control is like, no, we got to revise lower than we thought, and then you add year end +1. I mean, we weren't sure if he was going to retire at the end of the season. Like, if you wanted one thing, like where are we at on Travis Kelsey? But Rashee Rice represents that the offense continues to be in that box and Patrick Mahomes continues to struggle throwing deep. Like you said, Xavier Worthy, it's almost like Sammy Watkins back in the day where his tactical value to the offense is intact, but it doesn't show up in fantasy. It doesn't mean he's a bad player. It just means that the fact that Xavier Worthy threatens the defense deep, gets the safeties back, forces them to play too high safeties, helps the running game. Maybe he's Isaiah Pacheco. Maybe we should mention he's fallen from like a 3rd or 4th round pick to like a 7th round pick. I mean, if you think he's not going to get something back from the ankle, because we saw it when he came back, like we knew he wasn't going to be himself.
Exactly. Right.
But he hasn't got any major, except Brashard Smith. He hasn't got any major competition. Love Brashard Smith. But you're right that, when it comes right down to it, we can go into our supercomputer and enter all this stuff. And what it's just about is like, it's going to look like last year.
Yeah. I mean, in situations like this, though, the question I always ask myself is like, what changed to make us think that something will change, right? Like, at least in Miami, there was a lot of stuff going down in that offense last year, right? In Kansas City, what's really, really like fundamentally changed? Well, the change is, if anything, getting a weapon back who would not force the deep balls, would not force,
Right.
that kind of look. And we didn't see some massive, change with the offense with Mahomes after Rashee Rice left last year and went down. So like, I don't, I think that more often than not, if we don't get in our heads and have this like dreamlike scenario of, Patrick Mahomes getting back to 2021 levels and the Chiefs just chucking it deep all the time and it being really fun. I think more often than not, we're going to win those kinds of bets,
Yeah. Yeah.
like more often than not, if we just assume the median outcome for some of this stuff, the what we saw the last couple of years happening again. And then you have to think like, how am I going to be burned by not not picking up on the change, right?
Right.
Like if Kansas City does really switch their offense up and start to throw deep more and open things up that way more, am I going to get burned out of my mind on a player like Xavier Worthy? Because to me, I don't know if Worthy is the kind of wide receiver that's ever going to have like a top 12 type season under, like if he's going to ever be that dude in from a fantasy
Sure.
perspective. I think when he was drafted, I think a lot of people said he's probably, more of that. It's like Deshaun Jackson. Deshaun Jackson
Right.
was never like a dominant fantasy force, but he was a dominant player for his offenses. I mean, I remember doing research back like 10 years ago, looking at teams that got and then lost Deshaun Jackson. And it was always a massive change in their EPA, a massive change in their efficiency. And because he was making that kind of an impact as a player, but that doesn't always translate to fantasy with these kind of guys. And that to me is kind of what Xavier Worthy is. So I don't know if me maybe being slightly lower than the market on Worthy is ever going to like burn me if they do go in that direction. And that's still, a lower probability event to begin with.
Yeah. I like what you introduced there at the end, because I like if fantasy football is emotional, emotional intelligence. And like, what are you afraid of missing out on? Like when you think about
Right.
passing on a player and it doesn't uh, tickle anything inside, you'd be like, ooh, but some people might say like, oh, when I see Brees Hall in the third round this year, like I just really have trouble passing that because I remember how excited I was
Yeah.
last year. But Xavier Worthy, I mean, like you said, the archetype of players, like the player that comes to mind right now, JJ, is Jameson Williams. Well, you can get Jameson
Right.
Williams a few rounds later, so if you want that.
Right.
Matthew
Right.
Golden, even later than that, rookie, but
Yep.
still, down to the Texas connection. So yeah, I think that when we look at Kansas City, you're right. Just by process of elimination, it comes back to Rice, because you're saying, I like to say about fantasy football prediction, like meteorology, JJ. 80, if you just say it's going to be the same as was yesterday, you're right 80% of the time.
Yeah, it's true.
So
Yeah.
that's all you have
Yeah.
to do, folks. But that makes it that much more valuable to try to identify the scenarios where it's different than expectations.
Yes.
And this is why I stare at ADP a lot, JJ, and I look for larger trends. Like I look at the cumulative value of a backfield and the cumulative value of a passing game, just to see, and then compare that to where they actually finished last year to say like, oh, it's the fantasy football community. The hive mind's interesting, the wisdom of the crowd, because I don't even think some of this stuff crystallizes into something that people explicitly say or think, but you can tell, oh, the fantasy football community is skeptical about something. Even if nobody has said they're skeptical about it, ADP will show you collectively they're saying like, I'm not buying it. Or alternatively, like Drake London's an interesting guy. Like, wow, the fantasy football community doesn't feel burned by Drake London last year at all. Like, you're ready to make excuse. He's back in the second round. It was going to be Kirk Cousins. Well, no, it wasn't Kirk Cousins. Now it's going to be Michael Penix. Like, we're going to keep falling for this, or are we going to predict it? And you can see where the fantasy football community is. You can see what happened last year, and you can take a stance and say like they're right or they're wrong. And that's those gaps in the draft season of fantasy football are basically like where we live. Like what's what we're trying to discern and say like these are the ones to exploit. And it doesn't even change during the season. It's just a smaller time frame, and we're making a lot quicker reactions to things. We have all off season to deliberate our takes on this big picture stuff. So let's talk a little big picture stuff. That's so you're Mr. Go ahead.
No, well, I was just gonna say that the ADP conversation is something that, because like again, I do this draft guide every year, right? This is the fourth year I've done the draft guide, and a lot of my analysis historically, like back in like 2015, writing an article about and doing some research about like middle round running backs and finding breakouts, and how I realized that these ambiguous backfields are really where value comes from, right? Instead of the ones that are more clear cut. And stuff like that, where like I think that especially in the data side of things, and maybe this is leaning into the growth part that you were talking about earlier and the maturity of me in particular, but like the data side in particular, people are always trying to find this skeleton key to unlock, future success and predictability and all this kind of stuff. And you'll see charts on Twitter and on social media that are like, here are the metrics that correlate strongest to next season production. And the way that I've always tried to frame that, especially like in this year's guide, because I'm working on it right now, so it's really top of mind. But is how much of that though is already captured, right? How like I'm not really worried about the things that are gonna correlate to next season's success as much as I'm worried about the metrics and the things that people aren't aware of and factoring into their analysis, right? And so a good example of that is something like, touchdown rate at quarterbacks, just to go back to what we were talking about earlier. Touchdown rate at quarterback is something that doesn't correlate to next season's success at all. So a lot of people would throw that kind of metric out the window because they say to themselves, oh, this metric doesn't matter because it's not correlated to next season's success. But you can use touchdown rate a lot to your advantage because the market will use touchdown rate for next season's success. So a guy like Jared Goff this year, for instance, who's coming off the best statistical season of his career from a touchdown rate perspective and all that stuff, and now he's like QB8, that as a pocket passer, he's someone that's probably more of a fade than a target, just based on the fact that number is going to regress. And people tend to, look at that previous season production and take a metric and, don't look at that metric properly. Right. And so like that happens throughout. Like I just did an episode of the Late Round podcast today where I looked at because like one of the clear ADP trends is that people are still to this day undervalue pass catching at running back. They just, for whatever reason, it's something that is not factored in enough to the analysis, even in half PPR and in standard leagues. And I've always asked the question of like, okay, or I've always said, okay, target pass catchers, right? Like just get a middle round pass catcher at running back, you'll be good to go. Well, how do you get that pass catcher? It's easier said than done to just say, hey, go do this. It's like whenever we say good offenses lead to good fantasy production. Okay, tell me who the good offenses are going to be, right? Like tell me who that's going to be. And one of the things that I realized this year and that I'm writing about and that I talked about on the show is that previous season yards per route run at running back is actually pretty predictive of future season target share. And it's not so much that yards per route run at running back is some ungodly predictive metric that you absolutely need to use. It's just that in these little micro games that we're playing, and in these little micro instances where we're trying to find an edge and win, that's where we can leverage what the market isn't necessarily thinking about and take some of those metrics and take some of those insights and use them for ourselves versus how the market is thinking. So, I just wanted to say that because like you mentioned the ADP stuff and you staring at ADP, I do the same thing just from a really we're just coming at it from different perspectives at the end of the day.
Yeah, you have to understand one of the biggest elements of this, especially in draft season, this fantasy football analysis and advice thing that we're doing is understanding what the hive mind or what the conventional wisdom is. Because it isn't even just tell me who the good offenses are going to be. It's tell me who the good offenses are going to be that if you look across ADP in fantasy drafts, that the hive mind's not drafting them like they're going to be good offense.
Right.
And it's going to be, we're going to keep focusing on the same ones, right? Chicago, Las Vegas, Jacksonville, Jets are interesting. There are definitely some teams that we're looking at the delta, and like you said, like when we're comparing, this is like, oh god, some of this stuff is just such a bunk conversation to begin with, because if we're saying does X predict year n+1 productivity, like is it sticky? Well, first of all, you should take out every team that has a new coaching staff. Just take them out of the data sample completely.
Yeah.
And then maybe even teams have a new quarterback. Take them out of the data sample. Maybe even a new offensive coordinator. Then you have to look at like maybe the value of players lost to injury and are those players coming back or players lost to free agency. So pretty soon it's like, well, we're never comparing apples to apples. That's the thing. Every team, every of the 32 teams, JJ, it's like a great Russian novel or Dickens or it's each one is its own epic story that is following its own individual path, And while we can look at the other 31 teams and look at how different things have played out to inform us when we say like, well, which way do we think this is going to go? They're too unique, you know.
Yeah.
Every case
Yeah.
is too disparate from the other one to start making. There is no skeleton key.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is like, and this is my biggest issue with a lot of data analysis. It's that it's so factual in the way that it's spoken about, and it's so black and white, and that needs to stop. You know, like there needs to be nuance when you talk about Roma Dunze's rookie season. There needs to be nuance when you talk about you know, these shifts and changes that, you know, if someone has a certain season, you know, and you have to look into the why, like we're doing with Miami, right? And talking about like why these things went down with Miami. And I actually think, you know, because obviously like some of this stuff, when we say it's predictive, and you know, when I'm looking at it versus the market, I'm going to want to use those tools still, because I know that there's some predictability to it. But I'm not going to use one metric and say, oh, you have to draft this guy only because he had a good yards per route run rate last year, you know, because there's so much more to something like that. And you know, on the flip side, going back to like the stuff that correlates really well year over year, I think that the reason why I like to look at it versus the market also is because I think a lot of people double count those things in a way where they're like, oh, I like this player versus the market right now. Oh, but he also has this really good metric that generally correlates to next season's success. Oh, there's another great metric that correlates to next season's success. And then all of a sudden you're drafting him a round or two above ADP for no reason at all, because it's already baked into his ADP. So you don't need to do that kind of thing and that kind of analysis. So that's another reason why is I think that it's really easy to get lost in this data and think that some of the things that you're looking at are more important than they actually are, when you can actually just, I kind of ground myself with ADP, and then I just slowly shift back and forth based on what I know and don't know, you know, the market may or may not be looking at.
Yeah, well, I promised I wasn't going to rant about AI, JJ. I promised I wasn't going to do it. But I will say, like, with AI making analysis, summarization, you know, um, and even distilling it down to actionable recommendations,
Mm-hmm.
with that out there in fantasy football, right? I mean, we're in the business, we're in the industry, and of course that's a conversation. It's happening, and it should be happening in every industry in the United States.
Right.
And of course, like by human, like where I'm going to come down on this is like something about AI makes me, it feels like oil and water. Like, no. So all the
Mm-hmm.
stories we've watched growing up about how if we turn important decision making, I just watch war games with my 12-year-old. I love war
Mm.
games. There's a perfect story. Don't turn this stuff over to something that's not human. But if everybody's using AI, it makes our job even easier. Because again, it's like a name, right? That
Yeah.
we're not,
Yeah.
we're you know, like we're not gonna just um, be the average of everything. You know, we're using human experience to inform it, because AI can never experience anything. AI can only learn
Right.
from us. AI only knows what we tell it. AI isn't out there absorbing and synthesizing things like we are. And, you know, like you said, there's all these arguments, stats for things. But I mean, I'm a dormant lawyer, bar card. I remember in law school thinking like a lawyer. That was the main thing they would teach you. They would say, we're teaching you to think like a lawyer. And I always describe that as to take like, dude, to take a specific set of facts and argue both sides like vociferously and vigorously and be like, this is the right side. And then just like take a second and be like, no, this is the right side. As if you really fully believe with your heart the thing you're arguing, and arguing both sides. And you really just pick what you believed in the first place anyway, like your 50, you know, your yum or yuck, your gut
Yeah.
feeling. um and that's, you know, so I've one of the things I've been toying with in the last day or two, and this involves like understanding ADP, is some sort of fantasy football format where you draft blind, okay, and
Yeah.
you submit your pick and you get three chances. And if you pick three players that have already been picked, you lose your pick. So it's not just making a
Oh
pick,
man.
JJ, but it's making a pick that you think reasonably is going to be there. And then maybe like
Yeah.
every third round, you pull the curtain back and everyone can see who's still there. And you do like one round
Yeah.
where you're not blind anymore. And then you like
That'd
put
be
the curtain
fun.
back. But it involves
Yeah.
not just picking a player, but saying like who's reasonably going to be there at 2-8. Because if you're
Yeah.
just taking the low hanging fruit, but it's an exercise in understanding what other people think. But I want to know what you think, because we're a little bit abbreviated today. We're gonna have to go off the rails pretty soon. So I want to just really quick, because you said you've been working on the draft guide. So you ready to do like
Yes.
you ready to do, are you at the point in your analysis yet, JJ, where you're like just like in like 1 minute, like lightning round style, I can say like what's the overall approach at quarterback this year? Like and just step through each position, tap dancing.
Yeah, I'm not at tight end yet, but I could do quarterback, running back, and wide
Okay.
receiver pretty
All right,
quick.
you're
Yeah.
Mr. Ray on quarterback. So what's the in 2025? What do we see when we
Yeah.
look at the quarterback landscape?
Get the big four or wait a good bit and try to target some of those sophomore quarterbacks.
Oh yeah.
What's that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, okay, yeah, and target some of those sophomore quarterbacks. Drake May, Caleb Williams, JJ McCarthy, those types of players who we know are in good environments and can bring a little bit of that juice with their legs. Fade the pocket passers that are in sort of the middle rounds. Like I think Jared Goff is one of the easiest fades this year at the position. And then I actually think that you can make a similar argument, and I hate to say it out loud because it's very easy that can burn you. But I think Joe Burrow is kind of in that same bucket where he had a lot of things go his way last year from a volume perspective, from a touchdown rate perspective. Those two things are unlikely to merge again the way they did a season ago, just based on what we
Yeah.
see, just how game script will go and all that kind of stuff. Where he's still my QB5 ranked wise, but I'm going to be lower than the market in the overall because like you could go on in a best ball draft and see him get drafted over Jalen Hurts
Yeah.
pretty frequently, which I can't get. I can't do that. Like we know like the stability that we get from these early round quarterbacks, and I cannot believe I'm saying this after a decade of preaching the opposite for so long. But the market changed after Lamar Jackson's MVP season. People started to realize that the mobility is important. And also we get these unicorns like Josh Allen and obviously Lamar and Jalen Hurts and now Jaden Daniels, I think, is part of that group. But like the stability and the knowing and the predictability that these are going to be the guys, you can't just look at VORP and say, or value-based drafting, our friend Joe Bryant's value-based drafting. Like you can't just look at that and say, oh, based on this projection, we got to go. No, because there's a predictability aspect to it. And we know that these quarterbacks are going to be good. Like Josh Allen's been a top 2 quarterback in points per game for 6 straight seasons. Like that has to mean something similar to how it meant something back when we were drafting Rob Gronkowski and Travis Kelce in their heyday, right? Yeah. So I think you go elite quarterback, especially in like shallower leagues or like less competitive leagues, and then you wait and you get some of those sophomore guys. And if you're gonna wait even longer and get a pocket passer, get guys who either had low touchdown rates last year where the market's suppressing them. So one player that comes to mind often in this discussion is Dak Prescott.
Sure.
Where Dak has shown that he has that ceiling. But last year, he wasn't there. He obviously got hurt too. But that kind of profile, especially, I mean, Brian Schottenheimer is a very pass-friendly and pass-heavy coordinator as well in his philosophy. So, like, that kind of quarterback is one that will probably end up being a value at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think, well, look, I'm going to summarize a lot of content I'm going to write over the next couple months when I say, like, so my number one take at quarterback is just take Baker Mayfield. Just take Baker Mayfield. I'm loving everything I'm hearing out of Tampa about their new offensive coordinator.
It's hard to not like, because here's the other thing. When I talk about the touchdown rate stuff, people bring up Baker because Baker had a high touchdown rate last year, like that he's never done before. The difference though, and I'll throw Brock Purdy in here too. I think people haven't fully recognized that both Baker and Brock Purdy had good rushing numbers last year. They were doing a lot more on the ground. That if that aspect sticks, then they're going to be able to also sustain, their ability to produce. And yeah, with Baker, like it's hard to deny the weaponry that he has around.
Well, yeah, you added Ekbuka, who sounds like is a hit.
Yeah.
They're promoting from within. They want to go more vertical on offense. They have a tremendous offensive line. And the thing about Baker Mayfield's production last year, I'm thinking about our guy Dwayne McFarland. His tag was context matters. Okay, here's context.
Yeah,
Baker Mayfield. Remember, there was like a month of the season he didn't have Evans or Godwin.
Right. True.
So whatever numbers he put up last year, they were in less than ideal circumstances. And they added Ekbuka, and Jalen Millen was a little banged up. He's going to get even better. This is an arsenal. This is an Air Coryell. But you're right. So the other thing I'll say, quarterback, like you said about Joe Burrow, he's an elite scorer, but now he's being drafted like one. So no thanks. Because it's a little bit, just I can get Baker Mayfield 2 rounds later and get basically the same outlook. Or like you said, a ton of mystery boxes later on. Interesting. Or guys that you can say, like you said, Dak Prescott, we were drafting him in the top 5. In 2023, he was fine.
Yeah.
He's
Right.
probably going to throw the ball 675 times. C.J. Stroud drafting top 6 last year. And I know Stephon Diggs and Tank Dell aren't there, but he's like 19th. Justin Herbert, we were drafting in the top 5 or 6.
Yeah.
He's got like Roman and Harbaugh going to start cooking, man. That's going to get
Yeah.
better. That offense is going to get. So there's all kind. You can tell yourself a story, like you said, Drake May, Caleb Williams, Michael Penix, JJ McCarthy. So there's a lot out there. Okay, we could probably only do one. What would you rather do between running back and wide receiver?
Let's do running back.
Okay,
Let's go
hit me.
running back. Yes. All right, I would say I do think that we're going to see some regression hit in terms of how well the running backs performed last year and how they're going to perform this year. If you look at RB2s in particular last year, it was the best season for RB2s just in how they ended up performing and also the correlation between preseason expectation and postseason result. RB2s last year, best season we've seen in 15 years. I mean, it could be even longer than 15 years. It just didn't look past 15 years. But we're more than likely going to see more injuries happen. It was the healthiest that these running backs have been. I hate to say that. Obviously, we want everyone to be healthy, but we're going to see more injuries happen to these running backs. And what happens when there's not injuries, Sig, is that it's not so much that just like we see the correlation stick and these guys who we drafted early end up performing well, but it's also when running backs get hurt, we know zero RB, we know the fragility aspect of all of this, and we know that these running backs that'll step in are more predictable than a wide receiver who would be stepping into a similar circumstance with his starter getting hurt. But the difference is that those running backs that step in are generally not going to see 100% of the same production that the starter saw. Like if Josh Jacobs went down, last year, we would have had a general idea of who maybe would be seeing touches in that backfield, but not one person is going to match 100% Josh Jacobs. So what happens when there's a lack of injuries is that those RB2s are able to perform at a really high level, and we're not seeing any of them fall back to some of those backup running backs then performing at an RB2 level. So all those RB2s are going to be worse this year, right? And so I think it's going to be a good year for my go-to approach every year, which is more hero RB, where I'm going to lock in, one of those top-ish, top 5-ish up to like CMC or so running backs probably in round 1. And then, get some wideouts and feel good there. Maybe even get a quarterback or, a Brock Bowers or Trey McBride. I love George Kittle and where he goes as well.
Makes no sense.
The George Kittle stuff makes no sense to me. Like
together, we will push his ADP up to the level it should be.
It's ridiculous. But yeah, so like, maybe I'll go tight end or what have you, but I do think this is a really good year where you can get that anchor at running back, and then just kind of mess around with your RB2 spot, which is what we see most years. I just think last year it didn't work out as well. This year, I think we're going to see a bounce back with that kind of approach.
Yeah, I think hero RB is good. And I mean, depending on your outlook, you can find your hero in the 2nd or 3rd round too. I mean, if you like Devin Achane, if you like Jonathan Taylor, in the 3rd round, if you like Chase Brown, Bucky Irving's in the 2nd or 3rd round, Breece Hall, like I said, if you're still in on Breece Hall. So you don't have to take your hero in the 1st round. And if I'm reading you correctly, what I like out of this overall take, because there's something here, it's like buckle up for more chaos. There wasn't as much, like you're getting lulled into feeling like, oh yeah, like you said, injuries were down. It was such a quiet year on the running back waiver wire last year. And then something I want you mentioned real quickly about running back, I want to touch on before we move on too, that I look at when I'm staring at ADP, like you said, the muddled backfields, uncertain backfields. And there's a real simple exercise you can do, and this bears fruit every year, is just look at the running backs in the backfields that just go through and when is the first running back in a backfield taken, and the last 8 teams that have a running back taken, period. Okay, just look at those backfields. They're the ones that the fantasy football community is like shrugging and saying, well, I don't know. They're ones with some rookie, like Washington this year, Tennessee, et cetera, Minnesota, and that's where there's value to be had. And I do want to give you a really quick pop quiz. I didn't mean this, but what's funny, I was looking at this, JJ, and there was actually one backup running back who I think got 5 starts last year and outproduced the starter, and the starter was good.
I can't think off the top of my head.
Zach Charbonnet.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So Charbonnet and Walker together were like a top 5 running back.
Yeah. Right.
There's an argument to take. Charbonnet is kind of expensive for a backup running back, but there's an argument that like Walker in the 5th plus Charbonnet in like the 9th is the same as like a running back you take in the 2nd round.
Yeah, I mean, and that kind of approach, I think, has gained more steam also in like best ball environments where you
Yeah.
think you're capping your upside, but you're actually not capping your upside as much as you think.
Mm-mm.
But yeah, like the ambiguous backfield stuff is wild to me. Like you still see content on social to this day where people are like, like the Jacksonville backfield's a great example this year, where you
Yes.
get this three-headed monster of Travis Etienne, Tank Bigsby, and Bashaw Tutin, and people are like, oh, looks like it's a backfield to avoid. And I'm like, no, it's a backfield you want to target. Because if one, you're getting them all at this depressed cost. If one of them emerges, which inevitably happens in some of these backfields, you're going to be on that guy. That guy's a league winner if a guy semi emerges from that backfield. Like those are the backfields you want to throw darts at. And then like with the ADP analysis I do, I try to find trends that can help you spot who those big exceeding expectation guys are. And in the middle rounds, I mean, going back to the pass catching stuff, and even in the early rounds, like one of the things that I'm semi nervous about with Jonathan Taylor is, and his ADP is not like he's not a fade for me, right? So I want to at least preface with that. But it's really, really interesting. If you look at top 18 running backs since 2014 and you split up their previous season points per game by receiving points per game and then rushing points per game, and you look at the players who had sub 2.0 receiving points per game in that previous season, they're terrible the following year when they're drafted in the top 18. And the funny thing is, I did this in the guide. I removed Derrick Henry from the data set, and they're horrific.
Right.
Like literally none of it's just Derrick Henry that's allowing that to sustain. But I will say, if there's one running back that isn't Derrick Henry that could do that, it's JT. So like, yeah, right. So like, there's a little bit of that going on too. So that's how I approach this stuff, where I'm not being concrete and saying full fade. I'm just saying, hey, this is some of the stuff that's happened in the past that we should be aware of, and kind of go from there. But there's also trends like in the early rounds, top 18, where if you find guys who had really good receiving points per game in their previous season, they generally really outperform expectation the following season, which makes sense because receiving numbers are a little bit stickier. And so like some of the really interesting names in that bucket this year, Chase Brown is one, Breece Hall is one, and then the other one is Kenneth Walker. Shockingly. So like, those are the players where I'm like, okay, they likely will have some sort of pass catching role to a degree. Obviously you got to look at the changes, like Ryan Grubb being out of Seattle, I think might change the dynamic of the pass catching and how often they targeted running backs, all that stuff. But at the end of the day, like I do this stuff to guide me in a direction, not to give me the answer,
Oh, totally. No, I think that, you distilled it down really well when you said that the question about Jonathan Taylor in the second round is like, do you think he's Derrick Henry, or do you think that, Indy's an offense environment can create that? Well, it did in like the last 4 games last year.
Mm-hmm.
So, Jonathan Taylor at the end of the year last year was like good old Jonathan Taylor that we debated.
Winning,
like we debated it was him or CMC at the top of drafts. Okay. So much interesting stuff. But the last thing I'll say, I got to get the last word in, is like the ambiguous backfields, some end up being ambiguous for a good reason. Like nothing, some bear no fruit, but some do. And it's some of the sweetest fruit on the draft board. And I think the simplest level is like how good is the offense? Washington, Jacksonville, Minnesota is interesting because of the changes they made on the interior offensive line. I'm fascinated with Jordan Mason this year as like a David Montgomery, basically, like kind of a back, but he's like 4 rounds after Montgomery, who's cheap as it is. Okay, let's go off the rails real quick with my good friend, fellow Yinzer. We're not going to gripe about Pittsburgh sports because that's really it's gauche. Because we've had so much success as Pittsburgh sports fans, so we're not going to talk about that. Let's talk about summertime. What's summer mean to you? Like just summertime. What's it mean to JJ?
A lot of nostalgia for me. I grew up in a pretty typical suburban neighborhood north of Pittsburgh, and we had all these kids that were all these boys that were my age, and we would just you leave for the day and then you come back when the sun's coming down. Like I was still part of that generation in that era, and that kind of brings now that I have kids too, brings me back to that a little bit. Going to it's to me, so it's sort of like Christmas where you get that nostalgic feeling. I get that with summertime too.
Life is full of possibilities. Like a summertime day could yield anything,
Yeah.
You mentioned that. Like I remember I grew up south of Pittsburgh in a community, Bentworth High School, class of 93. It was like 6 small communities and people that lived in between those communities. But it was from a 1 stoplight town, which was the metropolis in the school district, Bentleyville. And there's a lot of woods in between all these different places, and we would meet up and have like these missions. This made me like 11, 12 years old. One time I can remember we all did the thing where you like sleep over at one person's house. Our parents weren't paying any attention to what we were doing. And we snuck out to an abandoned coal mine at night. We took our backpacks and stuff. We were probably like 12 or 13, incredibly
It's like the
dangerous.
Goonies.
Yeah. But you had the freedom to learn about yourself.
Yeah.
That's the heartbreak. And I say this as a kid who had a TV and probably watched way too much TV, and it broadened my brain. And I don't even want to think about what I would have been like in this generation with screens that are like hostile. Like we're giving our kids and ourselves over to the crack dealer, basically.
Yeah.
And it creates a different experience, and you're going to form differently. Like one of the things I've learned in my 49 years is, we learn about evolution, like Darwinism, like, it's this process that takes millions of years. We evolved from apes or something like that. But no, we evolved during our lifetimes. Like we changed to fit our environment and our practices, form follows function during our lifetimes. Like during our lifetimes, we change into a different kind of organism. And the things we expose our kids to, whether we're intentional about it or not, are going to affect who they become. And the fact that we as kids, JJ, got to decide what that was. Someone wasn't deciding for us.
Yeah.
And your soul kind of seeks out the experiences, hopefully, that make you who you were supposed to be. And we're taking that away from kids now.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what we try. Like, I have two young ones, 6-year-old, 2-year-old. And I want her to go, she'll be like, hey, can I go out in the backyard? Yeah, go alone and just run around on the playground. And if you fall, that you'll be okay.
Yeah. Even broken bones heal.
It'll be fine. And I try to approach parenting that way, as best as you can. It's tough. Sometimes you want a helicopter, but I try my best to not,
It's hard. Well, they already belong to the world. That's hard to give up that sense of control and responsibility. But I like the nostalgia angle of summer and just like the nighttime, like into when the street lights come on, like playing until when the street lights come on. And it was just always full of possibilities. And you said Christmas too. Like there's this sense of possibilities. And summertime, like the summer of your life. What's the Steely Dan lyric? Your everlasting summer, you can see it fading fast. So you grab a piece of something that you think is going to last. You wouldn't know a diamond if you held it in your hand. Things think you're precious. I don't understand. We're reeling in the years here. But the summertime is like it's never going to end, right? Like at peak summer, fish tour, summer tour is never going to end. Like at our peak, we're like in that, like the picture, the way we'll want to be remembered, or the way like the last thing will slant through our mind when we leave this plane are those moments, and we try to create as many of them as we can while we're here.
Yeah.
That's what summertime is for. And the couch is for hanging out with our good friends like JJ Zachariason. Draft guy's going to be coming out. You already know about Mr. Late Round Quarterback and everything that he's done for the fantasy football community and how much of a great dude he is to have around. We all hang around because you give us the opportunity. It's a privilege. It's precious. Thank you for letting us serve this for you, because it serves something for us. We're all keeping each other sane here, keep each other company as the world turns. And we want to turn with you because you're so classy.